Rothenburg ob der Tauber is a lovely town in the district of Ansbach of Mittelfranken, Middle Franconia, which is in Bavaria. One may even think of it as a well-preserved medieval city. When visiting the library, researching ancient records, I discovered that it was once an imperial city from the late Middle Ages to 1803. Rothenburg ob der Tauber translates as Red Fortress above the Tauber and overlooks the Tauber River. It was also an excellent opportunity to discover a little more about the German language and history. The words Rot, red, and Burg, fortified town, are said to refer to the red-colored roofs of the buildings, and some locals interpret it as being due to the practice of retting flax for linen production. Apart from what Rudd explained, reading certain records in English and listening to record keepers, one discovers that there was a weir system within the castle, which was constructed in 950. The Strohbachs were well informed about German history, but considering the belief system they adhered to, it seemed most unusual for them. The more I discovered, the more I wanted to know. Later, I borrowed more books from the library on the campus and learned that during 1070, the counts of the Comberg-Rothenburg dynasty owned the village of Gebstattel and built their castle on top of the mountain by the river. This dynasty collapsed in 1116. The last count, Heinrich, became Emperor Heinrich V and appointed his nephew Konrad von Hohenstaufen as his successor. Konrad became the self-styled king of the Romans, Konrad III, 1138 to 1152. He was said to have sold parts of the monastery known as Neumünster in Würzburg, located above the village Detwang, and built Staufer Castle, founding the city of Rothenburg in 1170. During 1241 to 1242, Staufer imperial tax statistics indicated that a vast number of Jews lived there. Even the Rabbi Meyer ben Baruch of Rothenburg was well known. He died in 1293, and in fact many of his descendants were members of the dynastic family von Rothberg and were bestowed noble status in the 19th century. They became the inherited counts of Rothberg, later taking residence in Berlin until the 1930s, where they were famous jewelers. During World War II, many of them were murdered, and 2 of the surviving children settled in the United States. We are told that the last family member, Andrew Sandilands, Graf von Rothberg, still lives there. The Knights of the Hinterland are said to have built the Franciscan monastery, as well as the Heilige Geist Hospital in 1376. A German order also constructed the St. James Church in 1336, which is still used today. And the Heilig Blut, Holy Blood pilgrims, have also attracted many others to this magical city. It was one of the 20 largest cities of the Holy Roman Empire, but Staufer Castle was destroyed by an earthquake in 1356. In October 1631, Catholic Johann Cercles, the Count of Tilly, deployed his 40,000 troops within the Protestant Lutheran Rothenburg. But although they defeated the city, many died. In 1634, the Black Plague killed many more. This way, it is said that Rothenburg did not expand any further. Thus, its 17th century structure remains. From 1803, it became part of Bavaria and was discovered by artists in the 1880s. Thankfully, new regulations have stopped major changes to the city. According to information and what the Strohbachs explained, it had a very special significance for Nazi supporters and was known as the German hometown. During the 1930s, Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, a Nazi organization, conducted regular day trips to Rothenburg, and the city was considered as the most German of German towns. This was probably the reason why the Strohbachs felt very proud talking about this city. I further discovered that in 1938, all the Jewish citizens were ousted by the Nazis. In March 1945, the German army was stationed in the city to defend it, and on March 31, bombs were dropped on it. However, U.S. Assistant Secretary of War John McCoy, appreciating the historic value of the city, ordered General Jacob L. Devers not to use artillery when taking the city. The local military commander, Major Thomas, ignored Adolf Hitler's command and surrendered the town. U.S. troops of the 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Division, occupied the town on April 17, 1945. McCoy became the honorable protectorate of the city, and after the war the city was restored to its former glory. This walled city faithfully reflects its medieval history and charm, but still remains a modern German town today. Rothenburg is featured in several films, such as Harry Potter and The Deathly Hallows, Parts 1 and 2, in 2010 and 2011. During that encounter with Magdalene, we visited other remarkable areas of this ancient city and listened to a performance by the city band in their colorful uniforms. After a light meal of German sausages, mashed potatoes, and sauerkraut, we took her home. This way, a very unusual but also an exquisitively romantic affair started between us. I no longer dwelt on belonging to a different race, and perhaps not looking too handsome compared with Germans, but she was not pure German anyway. In fact, when Ottomans marched into Hungary and came as close as Vienna, they blended with the native Hungarians, thus influencing the racial similarities observable today. I began to think in terms of belonging to the human race, and had every right to be happy. This was going to open up brand new vistas for me and Magda, even giving us the inner strength to walk towards the future courageously with renewed determination. As time went by, we happily met each other more often, usually after my work. I could not wait to meet her in front of the paper factory where she worked, and we often walked together to her parents' home. It was curious to see her mother either mildly or very heavily influenced by wine. Sometimes, after arriving at her place and chatting over cups of tea with Magda, her mother came home late from her part-time job at the local flower shop and almost immediately asked Magda to follow her into the kitchen. I could clearly hear them arguing over personal matters, she asking her over and over if she had committed herself to the weaknesses of the flesh. Magda would come into the room, wiping away tears, and sitting next to me, putting her head on my shoulder. She would tell me all about her allergies, when in reality she did not suffer any such ill. Her mother often followed shortly after, with a full bottle of wine in her hands, hysterically laughing, offering us some fresh apples and bread, while she drank directly from the bottle, dancing to music she alone heard. Magda, on the other hand, would ask me to follow her into the bedroom to talk to me in private about her spiritual interests and personal concerns. Sometimes she would put a record on to listen to the crackling sounds of Gypsy Baron or My Fair Lady in German. More often, however, she preferred to turn the radio on. I felt she did so because she did not want her mother to hear our conversations, who I knew was very curious, listening from behind the door, and in fact several times asked us to leave the door ajar. She felt the need to listen to us and ensure that we would not be tempted to do anything wrong. I could not disappoint her, and preferred to hold Magda's hands and walk in the park anyway. When her father arrived home, he always sat in front of the black and white television, turning its volume up rather loudly, at the same time putting on one of his marching music records. When he met me the very first time, I was introduced to him as just a friend, but he showed signs of being anti-me, obviously due to being previously conditioned in regard to dirty foreigners. The first few times I felt completely uneasy in his presence, and left a little early to walk home alone. A little later, Magda and I spent more time walking, talking about all kinds of subjects. Whenever I spoke to her about matters of the heart, she always told me of God's love, how he hated the evildoers, and that the world was filled with filth and ugliness. Although the subject matter was completely out of place, I went along with it. But whenever I attempted to talk a little about my own interests, she never listened. I tried to talk to her about the stars, flowers, and other interesting subjects, without being able to gain her interest. She always managed to go back to the subject of religious truths, while at the same time I tried to be a little more amorous. When we were able to spend time at her parents', her father Samuel, whom her mother referred to as Shamu, spoke to me about the music of marching bands and his efforts during his past military service. He told me how thankful he was that he did not have any Jewish blood in his veins. It seemed that this subject was an important issue for him, perhaps wanting to know if I had any connection with them. I was often advised by Magda's parents that according to the evangelical and Lutheran traditions they adhered to, premarital sex was not welcome. However, I felt the need to be very cautious about this issue of fanaticism, not because of their religious belief or the teachings of the witnesses, but because of my own principles, remembering my dear mother's concerns when I was younger. I did not want her to worry about pregnancy issues. Magda's enthusiasm in regard to the teachings of the witnesses was overpowering her thoughts, her every move, and her lifestyle. I hoped that it would be possible to achieve a little balance in her life and our developing friendship, so that she would not equate every life circumstance with cult-like viewpoints. Only time would tell. Premarital sex was strictly forbidden by the witnesses, and I knew for certain that the people she was studying the Bible with were indirectly interrogating her about this delicate issue, apart from advising her against any possible temptation. What surprised me most was that the person teaching the ways of their faith as being the only truth told Magda that an outsider, like me, could be dangerous to good morals. In other words, Magda was constantly advised against any relationship she may be engaged in with me. This continued for a very long time, until she apparently told them that Soren was a true believer and member of their order, but I believe that advice continued for a long time after. At the end, she declared that she would have no relationship with someone who was not a witness and not following the truth. However, I also knew that the witnesses were not encouraged to get married before Armageddon. Alarm bells were ringing loud and clear, but for some reason I did not hear them, and just drifted along with it all. I was unable to speak of the reality of things, and once again forced to live a double life. From outside, I was assumed to be just like them, and that is the only truth they could accept, while inside, one had to hide the reality of things in order to survive. I was in love with her, and hoped she would gain enough maturity to understand me, but she was in love with what she considered was the truth, as taught by the witnesses, and her love towards me was not an unconditional one. It was based on strict Bible teachings, as the witnesses preached. In other words, to be pleasing and acceptable in their eyes, one had to pretend to be just like them. If they had a different attitude, doing exactly what they preached, and showing me some real logic behind their teachings, I may have become truthful and faithful witness, just like they were. However, I was happy to see the real truth behind the multicolored masks they wore as faithful servants of God. In reality, one needed to blindly follow their dictates rigidly, not fully understanding the rules and regulations of the Bible as taught in their extremely draconian ways as being the only truth. Admittedly, I was blind to Magda's extreme fanaticism, even though the signs were very clear. In a sense, I was perhaps even indirectly hoping that she would change and that there was much to learn. I might have missed certain things regarding human nature in the past, but as time passed, I realized I was groping in the dark. I could not understand why I was never invited to where she attended her Bible studies, and was never introduced to her Bible teachers. They were her dearest brothers. It always remained a secret. I tried to ignore it, for there were more important things to consider. Her parents were extremely anti-witnesses, and that is probably why she preferred to tell them little fibs when going out. In fact, it did not matter whether she was going out with me or on her own. She often chose to tell them that we were going to a dance party or restaurant, whereas when outside, she would immediately insist that we went to the Kingdom Hall of the Witnesses instead. I got bored at those gatherings, and yet she seemed to have a good time listening to the repetitious and boring talks given by their elders and other ministering servants on the platform, the congregation reading answers from underlined sentences in their magazines, Watchtower and Awake. I remember so clearly that she obsessively preferred to frequent witness activities 4 or 5 times a week. Much later I understood that I was nothing more than a good excuse to go out with, supposedly to further our romantic endeavors, whereas she was the only one doing what she was interested in, and not what I wanted. By the time I was fully convinced that this was to be the only reality, it was already too late. She was utterly bent to doing their will. The more I associated with Magda's family, the more it became clear how much her parents resented her. She was unwanted. Her mother, Emilia Bauer, discreetly spoke to me how she had tried to get rid of her even before she was born, but she was stuck with her and had to wait to the end of her full-term pregnancy. She repeatedly said she used to take drugs including LSD or excessive amounts of aspirin, drink lots of wine, jumped up and down, climbed onto chairs to tidy the curtains, with a view to falling down, or have other accidents in order to facilitate a miscarriage. Shamu had no choice but accept adoption of the child. They just preferred her to disappear. This attitude shocked me. Emilia often exclaimed how happy she was that I, the unusual foreigner, came around, so that I could fulfill their long overdue wish, while her father continually complained that Magda's accommodation was too expensive. Emilia furthered her wisdom by saying that if I desired to touch Magda's naked body, she would not worry about it, as long as we kept sex out of the equation for the while. Magda was born in 1945, and her real father, as she was led to believe, was a high-ranking officer in the Gestapo, but nothing was clear. Obviously, Emilie, either being a free spirit or boy-crazy, would go with any officer in her youth. It was very hard for me to completely understand her, for she was always under the influence of wine. By studying her behavior, one could easily sense what she claimed could never be verified. She often subtly changed her story. Magda's stepfather, Samuel, was in favor of Nazi leadership and agonized about the fall of that regime. However, at least by listening to military marching music, he was able to relive his past memories from the days of serving his Führer as a member of the Hitler Youth. He was so happy when they outrooted the racially unfit trash from the fatherland. He talked to me very harshly, as he often spoke about it, and also that he was not quite sure about my background. A while later, after being told a few things in regard to my supposed origins, although I was unsure about what had been said, he exclaimed that he was happy that I did not belong to the unwanted race. I did not fully understand what he meant, but I always felt uneasy when in his presence. However, the subject of letting their daughter go had certain dominance in their persona, which could be clearly detected, especially when under the influence of alcohol. I believe that if and when I married Magda, although Samuel preferred a native German, he would see that we were in love and accept the situation. I often heard him arguing with his wife, saying that he was not happy about this character coming to their home and eating their food all the time. But I pretended I did not hear it. When it was explained to him that he finally understood the situation, he was calmed that I was contributing by bringing food before arriving at their place each and every time I visited them. For a time I continued with my employment at AEG in Kirchheim Tech. This is when I discovered that Samuel was working there as a storeman. What a shock horror it was. Whenever he was there with his workmates during morning coffee breaks or lunch times in the factory canteen, he deliberately made a few sarcastic remarks, and they all laughed at me. As my German language skills became better, and my understanding of it accordingly improved, I began to comprehend the spoken language extremely well, and with that I was able to understand what they were saying and why they were laughing at me. Samuel was telling those around him that this trash was his daughter's new boyfriend, and it was doubtful if she would at all like to stay with him. They kept laughing at me, and I deliberately pretended that I did not understand them, instead chose to laugh with them. They tried to talk to me in some form of broken German, thus forcing me to ask them, in their tongue, if they could speak German with me. This surprised them immensely. That was probably why Samuel asked me how come that I spoke just like them and did not say anything before. I told him later about my intention to speak the language just like they did, because I loved learning languages, particularly German. I believe my reaction to their bullying attitudes was the most appropriate way to deal with it. However, I always tried to avoid him. I believe that finally getting rid of their daughter, for she was becoming a little too expensive to feed and accommodate, gained more dominance long before they discovered me. If and when I married Magda, it would make things a lot easier for them. Not only by listening to their arguments, believing I could never understand them due to my lingual lag, but also what Magda was telling me was enough to understand the situation clearly. I continued with my work commitments at AEG in Kirchheim Tech, despite being laughed at, until they decided to move me to another area in the factory to test huge transformers used for higher electric energy distribution settings between cities. I also knew that some people were unwilling to see me advance, and so made it uninteresting and dangerously heavy, its purpose being not to appear as if dismissing someone like me on discriminatory grounds, but politely making me decide to leave the company on my own accord, although nothing untoward was said. I elected to simply pack up and go, visiting yet another factory as it was easy to obtain other employment almost immediately. But it was important that it did not interfere with my studies. This time I was testing the mechanical and structural integrity of gas heating systems by Bosch Junkers near Oettlingen. I began to travel a short distance on the train, and yes, I enjoyed the change. There was no break in employment, and the necessary income, which I had to have. I continued to pick Magda up after work from the factory Otto Ficker and walked her home. We both thoroughly enjoyed such walks. Often we consumed apples, a small amount of bread, and some wine with her parents, for this seemed to be only food available to us while furthering our romantic interludes. Occasionally joining her parents and watching the news on their black and white television. Although her father had the tendency to frequently change the channels, thus annoying Emilia. But as usual, Magda and I preferred to take long walks before taking her home and making my way to Sister Nurk's place, where I was living after the Strohbach's departure. I will tell you more about this shortly. At weekends, I met Magda at an earlier time, and we listened to her father's LP records of marching bands, although she rarely wanted to. I must have appeared as if I was enjoying them, and that made Samuel feel very pleased. I knew for certain that Magda preferred to listen to operettas, which her father could not stand. That was also my kind of music, rather than some types of military renditions. From time to time we met with her other relatives, and her Aunt Mitzi, a very corpulent woman, was very keen to get to know me a little closer. Probably I was seen as a possible candidate, as a kind friend, which she did not have previously. Her partner did not seem to worry about it. They were all known to be folkloric Germans, seemingly originating from different recesses of Europe. The entire family may have originated from where Magda was born, the city of many cathedrals. But I had no desire to discover anything about them, for I was more interested in getting to know Magda. Our romantic interludes became more intense and exciting, and I became even more tolerant towards her interests by giving her the freedom to be herself, by letting her be, while also hoping that she would become freer, looking at other alternative ways of thinking, perhaps even being a little analytical about those so-called biblical truths, and have time to enjoy life. At the same time, I discovered more discrepancies in scriptural wisdom, and therefore became more distant in accepting what was completely illogical as truth. Fanaticism was not a song I wanted to sing, for I was conducting a far more important study, preparing myself for exams and looking forward to the day of my graduation. I was determined to keep silent about many more things for love's sake, and just observe, for it was very hard to swallow the fanatical ideas being impressed upon a person like Magda, whom I cared for. The persona she presented was extraordinarily naive about so many issues of life. However, her only interest remained within the bounds of witness teachings, which were based on extreme viewpoints. At every opportunity, she proclaimed that I had to be a very advanced and surely a dedicated witness, knowing all about the truth, for, as she claimed, I was very intelligent, just like those other witnesses, teaching her their supreme wisdom. That was it. And nothing else could be expected from supremely intelligent people who chose to accept Jehovah above everything else. They had been issued with special cards indicating that they were Jehovah's Witnesses and would not accept any blood transfusions, although alternatives were acceptable. She had one given to her and got one for me too. It was a nice thought on her part, as she did not want me to sin in case one of us was involved in an accident and needed blood, for blood transfusions were considered as being consummation of blood, and the good Lord, in his supreme wisdom, demanded his chosen not to have it. This rule had to be obeyed even if it meant a life or death situation. I heard too many stories and read all about it in the newspapers everywhere. One such story still lingers in my mind. The little daughter of a Jehovah's Witness couple had experienced a terrible traffic accident, and her parents, together with their so-called brothers and sisters, prevented the medical staff from giving her the transfusion, surrounding the poor child, praying to Jehovah to heal her. Without a life-giving transfusion, the child could not survive, and there were no other alternatives available. They waited and prayed for a very long time, and the child eventually died. Instead of feeling the pain and even crying, some of them were smiling. They all declared that Jehovah must have loved the child so much that he had taken the little baby. In their wisdom, they knew that Jehovah was going to resurrect her in the new world. To me, it was like child sacrifice, but I said very little. This was not a unique experience, for it happened many times all over the world, in different circumstances and occasions. Consequently, many fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, and mothers have suffered the same. I thanked Magda as I took that card she offered me, and it was conveniently put away. This card was also issued in my name. She forever asked me if I had taken my all-important card with me whenever we went anywhere. I had a number of friends adhering to this faith. Therefore, I had to be no other than a faithful witness just like them, because apparently we were all commended not to associate with bad company to avoid having our good characters spoiled, as apparently written in the Bible. However, having friends adhering to their faith, or being reasonably knowledgeable about the Bible, did not make me or anybody else a witness. With Magda, it was never any different, because whenever she set her mind to something which she fanatically adhered to, she believed that it was the only reality. Unfortunately, love was truly blind. Could it be perhaps due to my mental blindness at the time? Was it due to me being very young, perhaps even too naive, believing I was in love with her without it being so? On one side, I thought that perhaps I was doing something wrong in the way I felt towards her, and on the other, I hoped things would change for the better. Maybe I had to wait a little longer before falling in love, or else wait for another opportunity to meet the right girl. Hearing my current state, my mother was very excited, and if I walked away from Magda, it would appear as if I was just playing around. Then again, whenever I met Magda, my feelings for her became stronger. Whenever I kissed her, I discovered that I could not let go, Yet whenever I thought about her fanaticism in regard to those cultist ideals, dark and brooding clouds surrounded me. On one side, I needed to concentrate on my studies. On the other, worrying about her was not easy. Furthermore, I was also concerned about my mother and dear brother, whom I wanted to assist no matter how small, but was unable to do anything because of my personal responsibilities at the time. My chances of seeing them soon were fast diminishing. Just one subject that would make a huge difference in my higher education was not very successful in my exams, forcing me to consider alternatives, with the option that I could continue with what I had originally envisaged a little later. This way, at least my efforts would not be wasted. I was invited to travel to London, with the prospect of furthering those studies. There was a dilemma which needed my immediate attention. I was in love with Magda, and it was the longest-lasting romance I found myself drifting into, although I was often hurt by the words, mannerisms, and sarcasm of her parents against me. But eventually they appeared to accept me, as they might have thought they had no other choice. I contemplated flying over to London, just for the adventure, and if possible, stay there for as long as I could, long before our romantic involvement became serious. I was intent on researching into ways to stay there on a permanent basis, but then again, England had a set of rules with their political systems, which one needed to consider. However, I had to try out what life had in store for me whenever an opportunity presented. I did not mention anything to anybody in this regard. I was curious about my studies in Germany and wondered how things would develop if and when I made my way to London before my relationship developed further with Magda.